went like this. There is a man who comes with the geese. Nobody has ever seen him. He comes in the fall before the rain, and he walks on the roof. And because he does, the rain stays out of the dormitory, out of the beds, out of everything. You can leave something on the kitchen windowsill for him. By evening, it will be gone. That's how you know. 40 children believed it the way children believe true things. Because it was one, dawn mist, a ladder against the eaves, a man on the ridgeline, and geese going over. For 7 years, the story stayed a story. The roof man came with the geese, the rain stayed out, and the offerings vanished off the sill. A drawing, an apple, once a small carved goose that took a boy all of September. Then came the 7th fall. The fall the men with papers came, with ledgers and language, and a plan to empty that house by Christmas. The fall a woman with a ring of keys had to choose between a promise she'd kept for 7 years and 40 children she'd kept longer. And the fall the children of the Marlowe home finally learned the roof man's name, not by catching him, by giving it away. The Marlowe home stood at the edge of Chapel Ford, a big clapper house with an oak in the yard, 40 children, and an endowment that kept them fed the way a tight fist keeps coins. Matron Constance Bell ran it on thrift and spine. Shoes resold twice. Gardens at Mended, a woman late 30s, with spectacles on a chain and a voice that could stop a fight through 2 closed doors. And in the front hall, over the coat pegs, hung the house's one piece of grandeur, a brass plaque, the name of the town's late great benefactor, polished weekly by rotating chore. The children polished it without ever once asking who he was, which was fitting, because the last thing that man ever gave the house was the water stains above the plaque. In town, there was a carpenter called Jonah Rusk, and Chapel Ford knew 3 things about him. His work outlasted its price. His shop had no sign, a carpenter's shop, and no sign, which the town found either modest or strange, depending on the porch. And he could not be thanked. Not wouldn't, couldn't. Praise slid off the man like rain off good shingles. Pay him, naw done. Anything more, and he'd find a reason to be under a wagon. Early 40s, gray coming in at the temples, a short beard and a flat cap, and a way of looking at buildings the way doctors look at patients. Nobody knew where he'd learned the trade. Nobody asked where he'd grown up. Chapel Ford assumed elsewhere. Chapel Ford was wrong by about 400 yards. The ritual was 7 years old, and it worked like a watch. Each fall, when the geese started, a note would reach the matron, never signed, never needed. Sunday next. Sunday next. She'd walk the children to church herself, all 40, and take the long way home. By the time they returned, there'd be new cedar on the weather side, flashing bright at the chimney. The gutters hung true. A season of weather answered in one day. No wagon in the lane by then. No invoice, ever. No name. Just a roof that never leaked, in a house that couldn't afford it any other way. Before the rain was all he'd say each year, loading his ladder while she watched from the back step. Before the rain. Every fall. Like a man keeping an appointment the sky had made. Only once had he nearly been caught. Toby, red hair, 8 years old, the Mitt's fiercest scholar, faked a stomachache one Sunday with the cunning of a much older criminal, and doubled back from the church road. He got one look through the stair window. A boot on a ladder rung, a trouser cuff, gone. He told the dormitory that night with the gravity of a man who had seen a comet. He's real. I seen his boot. June 11, dark-haired keeper of the legend, wrote it into the record she kept in a copybook under her mattress. Fall the 5th, boot confirmed. The offerings on the sill doubled that year. They were always gone by evening. Every one. Here is what Chapel Ford never knew, and what the matron alone had pieced together over 7 years of backsteps. Jonah Rusk had grown up in that house. 3rd bed from a window, boys' dormitory. The bed under the leak. He was 9 the winter the roof began to fail, and 10 the night the town's great man stood up at a charity banquet, promised a new roof to a room full of applause, and sat down to his dessert. The applause was the payment. It turned out the roof never came. What came was a winter of buckets, tin music all night over 40 children's heads, and a brass plaque going up in the front hall anyway, over the water stains, with a great man's name on it. Jonah Rusk aged out at 14 with a toolbox and one hard-earned creed. Help that wants watching isn't help. He'd been keeping it ever since. The pact had begun 7 falls back, with the old caretaker dead, and the roof failing again, and a stranger at the matron's kitchen door at dawn. He'd looked at the ridge line, not at her. I'll mend it, every fall, for as long as I'm able. I'll want the children away while I work, and your word that my name stays out of it. And your price. That was the price. She'd taken his hand on it, and kept the bargain to the letter for 7 years, with one small, careful exception she never mentioned. Each fall, on the back step, she brought him coffee before he left. The first year, he drank it standing. The 5th year, he sat. And once, only once, early, she'd asked him the question straight. Why won't you let them thank you? Jonah looked at the roof a while. Roof doesn't need thanking, he said. Needs flashing. She let it stand for the time being. So the years went fall on fall, the way good years do, quietly and in layers. The house stayed sound while the county's other institutions moldered. The myth thickened beautifully. June's copybook filled. New children were initiated by lamplight. The sill offerings grew ambitious. A whole drawing of a man on a roof with the sun behind him, rendered in a 7-year-old's confident crayon. Gone by evening. Every one. And the coffee on the back step got longer. The years she made him laugh. Actually laugh once briefly, like a board coming loose. She counted it privately as a feast day. The year he almost stayed for supper, she didn't push. 2 careful people, moving at the speed of seasons. They had time. They thought, Everett Marlowe was a great man's nephew, and he had inherited 2 things. The stewardship of his uncle's endowment, and his uncle's understanding of what names on buildings are for. Thin, pince-nez, a velvet collar in a wool town. He had plans, a commercial academy, his own name over its door, and one inconvenient obligation standing between him and the capital for it. 40 children in a big clapboard house. He went through the Holmes books in September the way a man goes through an attic looking for something to sell. And in the maintenance column, he found his lever. Nothing. 7 years. Not $1 recorded against upkeep. No invoices. No labor. No lumber. A 40-year-old building, uncared for 7 years, could only be one thing. Unsound. Everett Marlowe arranged regret on his face and requested an inspection. The letter reached the matron's desk in early October, county seal in careful language, and she read it twice with the ring of keys going cold in her lap. Inspection month's end. County Inspector Gow attending. Should the structure be found deficient, the children to be consolidated to the territorial institution. By Christmas, the territorial institution, a warehouse with a bell, 3 days away, where 40 children would become 40 entries. She looked out the window at the roof line, sound as a ship, and understood the whole cruel geometry at once. The building's health was its secret. The secret was a man. And proving the one meant producing the other, breaking the only payment he had ever asked of her. Outside, high and faint, the first geese of the 7th fall were going over, right on time. He came Sunday next, as the note had promised, and found her waiting on the back step with the coffee and the county's letter, and no easy way to do it. She did it anyway. That was her trade. He read it standing twice, the way he measured. They're not after the roof, Jonah. They're after the whole house. And the only proof it's sound. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. He was quiet a long time, looking up at 7 years of his own work. The tight ridge, the true gutters, the house he'd been paying a boy a debt to one fall at a time, invisibly, the only way he trusted. You're asking me to stand in front of them, he said. I'm telling you what it costs if you don't. The kindest sentence she'd ever handed him, and the heaviest. He set down the coffee. Tell me the rest of it, Constance. First time in 7 years, he'd used her name. She told him. And then, because turnabout is a matron's privilege, she made him tell her. All of it, at last, on the back step. The 3rd bed, the tin music, the banquet, the applause that turned out to be the payment, the plaque over the stains. A man wanted his name on this house. Jonah finished, The house rotted under it. I learned what help that wants watching is worth. Constance Bell heard it through, and then answered it the way she answered everything, gently and dead center. The children don't want to watch you, Jonah. She let that sit. They want to know you're real. There's a boy in there who's believed in you harder than Scripture for 5 years on the strength of one boot. Then she went inside and came back with a ledger he'd never seen. The house log. 7 years of entries in her small hand. Roof mended before the rain. GR. Dated. Every fall. I kept your name out of town, she said. I never promised keep out the truth. He didn't decide out loud. He decided the way he did everything, with his hands. He worked the 7th fall as he'd worked the other 6. Cedar on the weather side, flashing at the chimney, the gutters trued, the finest patch of it he'd ever laid, because a man's work was about to speak for him, and he meant it to speak plainly. But this year in the attic, kneeling under the ridge, he did the one thing he'd done every year and let it mean something new. The iron in his hand heated over the little lamp, and besides 6 small burn marks on the rafter, JR, 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 each with a date beneath in scratch figures. He burned the 7th, dated it, packed his tools as the first cold drops began to spot the shingles overhead. Before the rain, he said to the rafter, and went home to wait for Friday. Everett Marlowe dined with Inspector Gow on Thursday and was generous with the wine and the conclusions. No repairs in 7 years, Mr. Gow. Not a dollar. The place is a shell wearing paint. You'll see it in the first 10 minutes. He aligned his knife with his plate. Condemn it by Friday, and those children will be warm in the city by Christmas. Everyone is served. Gow. Stocky, gray Matron chopped, a man who had crawled more attics than the trustee had entered, made a non-committal sound and kept his own counsel, as county men do. Marlowe glanced out the window toward the edge of town, where a certain roof line stood against the evening. And that roof, he said pleasantly, will finally come down with the rest. Friday came gray, with a sky-building rain. The whole board attended. So at the schoolroom windows did 40 children. Inspector Gow went up the attic ladder with a lantern, expecting what 7 years of empty ledger columns promise. Rot, sag, daylight through the boards. He was up there a long time. When he came down, he had the particular expression of a professional man recalibrating, and he addressed the board with his lantern still lit. Gentlemen, I've inspected 40 roofs this year for the county. He looked at the ceiling. This is the soundest structure I put a knife to. New cedar laid right. Chimney flashing better than the courthouse. Joist dry as a sermon. Marlowe was up before Gow finished. Impossible. There are no invoices, no record. If work was done, it was unauthorized, amateur. Amateur, Gow said mildly, is not the word I'd use for the man who signs his work. He held up his notebook. Copy careful. There's a mark burned into the ridge rafter, gentlemen. 7 times. Dated each fall. GR. The matron rose then and laid the house log open on the table. 7 years of small-handed entries, dated to the day, matched line for line to the rafter's burns. The board bent over it. Marlowe began building a sentence about irregularity, and the front door opened. Jonah Rusk stood in it with his toolbox in his hand. Come the way he came every fall, through a door he hadn't used in 30 years, in front of everyone for the first time. The schoolroom windows went off like a covey of quail. He set the toolbox down and answered the question a woman had asked him on a back step years before, and the only place it could finally be answered, out loud. I slept under this roof when it leaked. 3rd bed from the window. The board went very still. A man promised us a new roof at a banquet once. Got his applause. We got the buckets, and his name in the hall over the stains. He looked at Marlowe, level as a chalk line. I learned what help that wants watching is worth. So I helped the other way. The finding entered the record before noon. Structure sound, consolidation without basis, petition denied. And then Inspector Gow, closing his notebook, asked a question that turned the trustee's own lever back on him. Mildly, the way county men fire their best shots. One matter for the board, though, the endowment carries a maintenance allocation. 7 years of it, by these ledgers, unspent. He looked at Everett Marlowe over the mutton chops. It plainly never came here. The board will want to ask where it went. The board wanted to ask. The asking took the rest of the autumn, cost the trustee his stewardship by Christmas, and funded, among other things, 40 pairs of new boots. But that was later. First, there were the children, released in the schoolroom like a damn failing, and led by a red-haired boy who hit Jonah Rusk at a dead run and stood there gripping his coat, looking up. I knew you were real. I seen your boot. You did. Jonah agreed gravely. Nearly cost me everything. He didn't know about the drawer. So the matron told the children how every offering off that windowsill, 7 years of them, was in the carpenter's shop across town in a shallow drawer he could not explain and would not empty. The drawing of the man on the roof with the sun, behind him, the apples, long since seeds in his garden. The small carved goose that took a boy all of September. June wrote it all into the copybook that evening, with a librarian's severity and wet eyes. Fall the 7th. Roof man, confirmed entire. And some weeks on, when the charter was renewed and the board remade, a petition arrived at the county office in 40 different childish hands, with one request, spelled variously but unanimously. The county, having recently developed a sense of humor about that house, granted it. The matron walked him to the gate herself, on a bright, cold morning, to where a cloth hung over the new sign. The children named it after you, she said, and pulled the cloth. Rusk House. Plain letters well cut where a brass promise used to hang. Jonah Rusk, who had hidden his name for 7 years like the last thing he owned from a boyhood that owned nothing, stood at the gate and read it 4 times, and had a look at the oak a while. I never wanted my name on anything, he finally managed. I know, said Constance Bell. That's why they wanted it on everything. He came back the next fall with the geese, as always, through the front gate now. Toby footing the ladder like a sworn deputy. June logging the work for history, half the dormitory learning what flashing was. And when the roof was done, he mended the matron's porch step, unasked, before the rain, and asked her something with it that had been 7 falls in the framing. She said yes before the rain came. He still came every fall after that. He just stopped coming alone.